So welcome again. It is our pleasure to have here with us 3 colleagues from the European Commission who will give us an overview of the opportunities that await Icelandic higher education institutions in the area of international cooperation. And we're also very lucky to have with us a person who has benefited herself from participating in Erasmus Mundus. Again, my name is Rúna Guðmarsdóttir. I'm here with my colleagues Hulda and Solveig from the Erasmus Plus higher education team at RANIS. And we are very happy to be with you. I hope you have a nice cup of coffee or a tea and can relax and enjoy having this discussion with us on this snowy morning in Iceland. And I've just been told that there's also snow in Brussels, so that's quite unusual. We will start with a few introductory words from my side, from the national agencies side, because we believe that there's plenty of unlocked potential when it comes to cooperation between Icelandic higher education institutions and those outside of Europe. We know that Icelandic universities, they have been very active when it comes to international credit mobility, but we haven't seen many applications in the centralized actions in Erasmus Mundus or in capacity building for higher education. So this is something we would very much like to improve in the new program. And I think this info session today is certainly a step in the right direction to create more awareness of the possibilities that there are. In our strategy, the NA strategy for internationalization in Erasmus+, we have a few aspects that I would like to highlight here today. Namely, we would like to aim for a wide geographic distribution, which is also strategic to the vision of the participating higher education institutions. And what we would like to do more of is to analyze further which regions of the world have been undersubscribed when it comes to cooperation with Icelandic institutions. And we would like to seek ways to strengthen relations between Icelandic institutions and institutions in those countries specifically, for instance, through contact seminars. Secondly, I would like to mention that we would very much like to see a stronger links between Erasmus Plus and the foreign policy of Iceland, both in terms of regions and countries, but also in terms of topics, so thematically. I can name here human rights, for instance, which is one of the cornerstones of our foreign policy. And this is highlighted in Iceland's International Development Cooperation Strategy, together with gender equality, peace, and security. So we would very much welcome applications that focus on these areas. And then thirdly, I would also like to mention that in our national agency, we are trying to promote even further synergies between different actions of Erasmus+. And for us here today, this means that we aim to bridge the gap between different sectors and mechanisms that aim for global cooperation. And I can name an example. We think that capacity building projects can be an excellent way for those institutions who are already cooperating in international credit mobility to continue their cooperation in a more sustainable way. So we also think there's a lot of potential with the virtual exchanges, which have not been used that actively among Icelandic citizens. So we aim to promote this possibility even further. But without further ado, I'm happy to give the floor to our excellent speakers today. And we will take questions and answers at the end of each presentations if you have any pressing issues. And we kindly ask you to raise your hands when each presenter has finished their slides. And then we will have also a common Q&A session at the end of the webinar as a whole. You are also free to use the chat if you like for any questions. And we kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted during the webinar, unless you're speaking with a question. So we will begin with Christos Ivaliotis, who is a policy assistant with DG EAC's International Cooperation Unit. Christos is a member of the ICM team, as well as a desk officer for Pacific and Middle East regions. For the last 10 years, Christos has been working in the field of international cooperation, both in the European institutions, but also in the private sector. We're very happy to have you with us, Christos. The floor is yours, and you will tell me when you need a new slide, like now. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Runa. So, hello everybody. My name is Christos. I work with the ICM team within the C3 unit of DG EAC. I'll be mainly focusing on the international credit mobility in my presentation, but I will give you also a brief introduction about the international dimension overall. Like this, my colleagues covering the other actions do not have to mention some general figures about the international dimension. So Runa, we can start, I think, with the next slide. So I guess you're all familiar already, but when we're talking about international dimension of Erasmus Plus program, we're practically talking about actions that are open for cooperation and partnership between the countries that we see in the blue and those in yellow, to put it very easily and visually on the map. There is a slight change in the terminology we'll be using in the new program period. For those that have seen already our new program guide, program countries are now member states and associated third countries, while partner countries are non-associated third countries. This is more of a new legal definition, but in our promotion, I think we will be using still the old terms as more audience friendly. So we'll be still talking about program and partner countries throughout the presentations. Next slide, please. The international dimension of Erasmus Plus, as before, contains a mixed funding. Part of our international actions are supported by the Erasmus Plus budget line, so the internal budget for our program, and the external financial instruments. So what we'll be seeing from the external financial instruments in the new program period is a bit more than 2 billion euros. You can see that there is a slight increase compared to the previous periods. And this breaks down to two external financial instruments. There is IPA 3, covering only the Western Balkans with 374 million euros, and NDICI, covering the rest of the world with 1.8 billion. And NDICI stands for Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, bringing together a multitude of financial instruments we had in the past. So we're aiming to hopefully simplify some of the procedures by having a common source of external financing for the rest of the world, apart from the Western Balkan region. These figures, of course, cover the whole period, cover all program countries, and they cover all international actions. So they're not only, of course, about international credit mobility. There is a slight difference in the composition of the regions compared to 2014-2020. So we are seeing some new regions appearing, and many of the old regions have now been redesigned to contain a mix of high-income countries and the least developed countries. So now the new regions are more on geographical basis and less homogeneous when it comes to equal levels of socioeconomic development. We can go to the next slide. Here again, to visualize things a bit for you, as you can see, and for those already familiar with ICM and the other international actions that are following this regional breakdown, the first 4 regions, which are the most neighboring regions to Europe, have remained the same. Asia, mostly the same, but now it includes the high-income countries. Afghanistan has moved from Asia to Central Asia. Middle East is now containing also the high-income countries, the Gulf countries that were not eligible for international credit mobility in the past. So now they will be able to access all actions or international actions for high-income countries. There is a new region, Pacific, that brings together all the small Pacific islands plus Australia and New Zealand. Sub-Saharan Africa is now separate from Caribbean and Pacific, as we see, and constitutes a region on its own, including South Africa, that used to be a separate region in the previous program. There is Latin America without Cuba. This is one difference because Cuba is now joining the new Region 11 on Caribbean. And then US and Canada are a region on their own. Okay, we can move on. Now, if we're going more into details about the international credit mobility, here you can see the difference in the geographical breakdown of our budget. For those Icelandic institutions already familiar with ICM, you know that the budget that you receive for our action is not a common pot of money as it happens for intra-European mobility, but there is a little regional flag on top of every amount. So here you'll see, and maybe you've heard the rumor before, we're going for a big portion of the ICM budget directed to Sub-Saharan Africa. This is the biggest geopolitical priority for the European Union, and it's reflected in most of our actions. So it will absorb more or less 1/4 of the ICM budget. There is a slight increase in the budget for Western Balkans, and the other regions are either stable or have a slight decrease. Of course, because the overall budget for ICM has increased, as you can see in the middle of the 2 circles, the percentage decrease in some of the regions is not as big as it seems, because it's like a smaller percentage, but a smaller share, but of an overall bigger total amount. Okay, we can move on. Now for Iceland, this is the budget for the 2022 call. So they're around 640,000 euros. Still, these amounts are a bit tentative because we keep having some readjustments every now and then. Hopefully, they're usually adjustment as in increases of the budget we can allocate, because we have some leftover funds that we can still transfer to the next call. But this is more or less the amount we can be expecting, and the regional percentages are more or less stable for all program countries. So if you do the math, you'll end up with the biggest envelopes, regional envelopes, of course, with Sub-Saharan Africa around 165,000 euros, Western Balkans a bit more than 100,000 euros, going down to the smallest regional envelopes that are between 4,000 and 6,000 for Pacific, Middle East, and the Caribbean regions that stand somewhere at 1% of the overall budget. We can move. What are the activities that are supported? This is just for those institutions among you that might not have been working on ICM already. We're talking about the short-term higher education mobility for students, academic and administrative staff, pretty much replicating the intra-European mobility for higher education, but with the rest of the world. All level and study cycles are eligible. There can be mobility in any subject or academic discipline. The action also supports traineeships for students and training for staff. And the study periods and traineeships can start as of 2 months and going up to 1 year. This is a small novelty that we decreased the minimum duration from 3 to 2 months. This is one of our inclusion measures to allow people that cannot go for very long abroad. Another new component, there is blended mobility. Again, this is something that was already introduced for intra-European mobility, and we're aligning for the for ICM. Blended mobility meaning a physical mobility of 5 to 30 days, combined with a virtual component that can take place before or after the physical mobility, or both before and after the physical mobility. We can move. To the next slide, please.
You don't see the new application form, regional approach?
Now, yes. Now, maybe okay. There's a small delay.
It took some time. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so there is also a new application form with the regional approach. Again, hoping to simplify the life of applicants as assessors compared to the previous program period. Before, we used to have 4 quality questions. Now they're down to 3. One at project level, which will be the project design and cooperation arrangements. So this needs to be answered only once per application. And there are 2 quality questions to be answered for each region the applicant intends to cooperate with. These are relevance and impact and dissemination. Again, the difference, it's obvious for those that have applied for ICM before. We needed all the questions to be answered per partner country. So making our applications very, very long and delaying the assessment process within the national agencies, especially in the larger program countries. The regional approach is not only reflected in the new application form, but it's also reflected in the budget management during implementation. The flexibility we introduced during COVID time to be able to shift funds between countries in the same region will be maintained as a permanent feature of the action. So in practice, during the application, applicants still need to indicate the number of mobilities they intend to have per partner country in the same region. This is done for grant calculation purposes. Also because the national agencies need to achieve certain geographical targets, so they need to see with which countries you intend to cooperate. But during implementation, it will be possible to shift funds if there is any issue prohibiting cooperation with a certain country. Of course, it doesn't mean that someone can present one project and implement a completely different one, but in cases of force majeure, it's not only about the pandemic, it could be many other different occasions. This will be possible. We will be also asking you to apply only for student and staff mobility without specifying the type of activity. So there will be no distinction between studies and traineeships or teaching and training for staff, since this doesn't have any impact on the requested budget. We thought it might be easier that you ask only for student and staff mobility, and later on during implementation, you can reflect it better. Of course, if you already know and you want to plan it, it's good that you mention it in your strategy, either on regional level or on the project level, because that would be also taken into account. And there will be also an estimation about participants with fewer opportunities. One of the main conclusions from the previous period is that because of the quite strict budget lines that we have in ICM, whatever part of the grant is not distributed immediately, it's very hard to get it during implementation. So we wanted an estimation in order to channel some funds already at the very beginning to reflect those mobilities with fewer opportunities that by default are more expensive and might require more funds. Of course, these are not there is no commitment, it's just an estimation, but it will help us and you to have the necessary funds when these participants appear for a certain mobility. Okay. Next slide, please. Overall, there is a stronger focus on inclusion. As we said already, there is the blended mobility option. This is not only to reflect the current reality of the pandemic, but also as an inclusion measure. Here we're thinking more of participants that cannot go abroad for a very long time for different reasons. It could be physical disability, it could be students with young kids, it could be students that need to work at their home country and cannot live for very long. The same is reflected in the new shorter minimum duration for the physical mobility. We're opening up to recent graduates for traineeships. There is a more flexible format for doctoral candidates that can actually go on mobility both as students and as university staff, depending on their status within their home university. And there is a special inclusion support both for individuals and for institutions now. Okay, next slide. Good news, there is an increase in the organizational support. So again, for those that are familiar with ICM, we remember there was 350 euros per participant. Now it's up to 500. This is one of the few elements that we have differentiated our action compared to the intra-European mobility. So we're aiming for a higher organizational support, also to cover some to help you cover some costs of the participants that have been identified as main inclusion barriers, namely insurance or visa costs that appear. And so far, we have not been able to have a specific unit cost to tackle them. This is a work in progress, but in the meantime, a higher organizational support could cater for these purposes as well. The individual support remains unchanged, just with the addition of the daily rates for students as well, now that there is the short mobility in the blended format, and the contribution to travel cost also remains unchanged. Okay, next slide. As before, there are certain priorities and indicative geographical targets in different regions. They're all described in the new program guide. Do not get too stressed about them, at least not just yet. They're to be attained at the European level, meaning by all program countries together and over the whole duration of the program. Of course, the national agencies will try to take that into account in every selection round, but it doesn't mean that every institution for every call needs to absolutely respect those indicative targets. Something that has been with us before, and now because of the new mixed composition of the regions that came from our friends in the external relations DGs, will make our life slightly more complex, is the restrictions for outgoing master and bachelor students to developing countries. So before it was kind of easy division because we had regions mainly with developing countries and with industrialized. Now it's more mixed. Therefore, what we did in order not to restrict those mobility to countries that didn't need to be restricted, we're using the OECD's order list. You have the link there, so later you can visit the relevant page and check. So practically will be using this list to define for each call which countries have this restriction. Okay, maybe we can go to the next slide because we try to visualize it in a table. So you'll see here in red practically which flows are restricted for ICM. Okay, so that means that all incoming mobilities are fine, outgoing PhD and staff mobility is also fine. We're talking only about outgoing from Europe to these countries mobility for a master and bachelor. Okay, most of this was already the case before if we're talking about developing countries in Asia and Africa. Big difference is that now the neighborhood countries, South and East, are also affected. This was not a program decision. Unfortunately, it comes with a legal basis of the new financial instruments that we have in NDICI. The good news is that it doesn't apply to IPA 3, so Western Balkans are exempted. So even if you see the Balkan countries in this ODA list, this restriction is not applicable to them. Okay, you'll see that some of the countries, for example, like in Latin America, there is Chile, Panama, Uruguay, have been already graduated in the OECD terminology from that list. Therefore, this was one of the main reasons we wanted to use that list in order not to say by default Latin America region 10 has this restriction. We want to go country by country to give as much flexibility as possible. This list is being revised every couple of years. We will be reflecting that in our guidance documents and in our IT tools. So you don't need to worry about it. It will be monitored by us and we will be giving guidance to the national agencies. Next slide. In order to be able to cater for these restricted flows, among other things, there is also the international opening of Key Action 131 of the international mobility. Usually it wouldn't be up to me to present it because we have a great team dealing with intra-European mobility, but we're trying to bring it into the picture when we're presenting ICM because the two strands now of international mobility for higher education will be compatible. So we're talking about practically two strands of the same type of mobility. As you've seen in my presentation, we try to align almost all the characteristics so that beneficiaries that have both key actions do not need to implement completely different rules or rates. The funding source, of course, is changing. The intra-European mobility is funded with the internal Erasmus Plus budget, so they can use up to 20% of that project grant for international mobility. So there is a certain cap, but it's one budget for the whole world. So you don't have this regional approach, while as we said for ICM, it's still the earmarked budget envelopes per region. We can go to the next slide. The available funding in 2022, practically if it would be a maximum use of this 20% from 131 for international mobility, that would double the amount that we have. So you'll see it's almost 200 million from both sides. Of course, the signals we're getting so far is that because usually in the first calls of every program, we start with slightly lower amounts. That means that maybe in many cases, beneficiaries will have to use the whole 131 budget for intra-European. They will not have so much room to transfer to international, but these are the amounts. The geographical scope and flows are also slightly different. 131 is completely worldwide. There is no restriction at all. That includes also the regions 13 and 14 that are not part of ICM. Here we're talking about the microstates in Europe like Andorra, etc., and Switzerland, Faroe Islands, and the United Kingdom. So they are covered by 131 that can only cater though for outgoing mobility. For us, it's worldwide except 13 and 14. We, of course, have both flows, outgoing and incoming, with the associated geographical targets. Next slide. At application stage 131, probably you've seen it at the 2021 call already. There is only one indicative percentage for international mobility. For us, as you know now with my presentation, there is a quality assessment per region. And of course, there is the approval of certain country flows. For the implementation mode, the selection of partner countries and HAYS for 131 international happens during implementation. So that's another more flexible aspect on their side. With ICM, of course, the approval of partner countries and HAYS have to take place at application stage, with the possibility to change or add only partner HAYS during implementation, but for the countries that you have received the budget for. Overall, we see the two actions as complementary. 131 International gives more flexibility because of the different nature of the funding, and it could serve also to establish links with countries that ICM could not offer enough funds, or like to complement existing ICM projects, for example, for those flows that we have to restrict on our side, so outgoing student mobility to certain countries. Okay, I think now we're at the end of the presentation. No, sorry, there was one more slide, just the timeline. The call was just published a few days ago, deadline 23 of February. The evaluation process will be running from March to July, with the aim to start projects on the 1st of August 2022. Here is a slight difference with 131 because their projects are starting 1st of June. But we wanted to keep a later start for ICM because we know that the evaluation process takes much longer due to the complex distribution of the different regional envelopes. So we didn't want to put it 1st of June, and then either we stress our colleagues at the national agencies too much, or we know by default that this 1st of June will not be respected in practice due to delays. So this is why we didn't want to change to earlier. That's all. I think I more than exhausted my time. The floor is back to you, Runa, and I don't know if you want to collect a couple of questions now or at the end.
Many thanks, Christos. I think we have time for one or two questions at this point. We already had one in the chat, but it has been answered. Are there any participants who would like to take the floor? It was very clear and comprehensive, Christos. Thank you very much. It doesn't seem to. Oh, yes, we have one from Nana. Please, Nana, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative. There was a slide where you had the estimation of participant with fewer opportunities that were to be added to the application. Runa, could you maybe go back to that slide for me? So I'm wondering about the estimation of participants with fewer opportunities. How is this defined? Is this definition something that we get from the national agency, or is there something from the Commission that we need to be aware of? And then my second question regarding that, do we just assume that the participants from the OECD countries are participants with fewer opportunities? Or is there another criteria that we need to add to that?
Okay, thank you. So on the practical side, it will be just an estimation of the figures. So let's say for a certain country, you want to have 10 mobilities and you estimate that 1 out of 10 might be with fewer opportunities. So it's purely on a quantitative basis. We don't need to specify what type, if it would be with disabilities, etc. It's more to be able to predict very roughly, because of course it's all an estimation at that stage, how many mobilities will need a top up on top of the normal individual support we're giving. There is an inclusion and diversity strategy by DG EAC and accompanying guidelines of how to interpret it. There, I think, if I remember well, 8 categories outlined. Fewer opportunities now cover almost everybody, like all categories that we had before, mentioned with different names, like physical and mental disabilities, disadvantaged background, everything is under one definition. So all the different categories are outlined there, but of course, then it goes to every country to practically create like a list of how this will be implemented. The national agencies will be also in touch with the national authorities in its country, because of course in many cases you might need specific documentation to be available, etc. And we're now discussing also internally, but with the national agencies as well, how this will be reflected for the incoming participants, because of course this will require cooperation with the third country HAES and third country authorities to be able to find same or similar procedures and documentation to prove this background. But the definitions will be defined at national level. So I will let you discuss this with our colleagues at the national agency, how this will be done. We cannot do it, of course, on our level, because the national background is very different from country to country. There are countries that have very strict legislation. They have already very specific experience and traditions when it comes to inclusion. So of course they might need to prioritize, and some other categories might not be even considered with fewer opportunities in certain backgrounds. So it will be defined at national level. Something that is now cooking up, and I can give it to you as a kind of advanced information, but I don't know when and how it will be really implemented, is that we're discussing the possible decoupling of the of the quality of a participant as fewer opportunities and the trigger of the extra financial support, because in some cases the support already exists on national level. So we got the signal from many countries that they don't want to spend more EU money because there is national money for the same reason. So we will try to find some middle ground there to be able to still, for statistical purposes, mark this as a fewer opportunities mobility, but without necessarily attributing more budget. But this is still a bit work in progress, but just to give you an idea that the debate is really heated on inclusion, both internally in DG EAC. It's one of the biggest priorities for the whole program, not only for ICM, and within the national agencies as well.
Thank you very much for the heads up, Christos, and also thank you, Nanna, for the question. I think it was a very relevant and a good question. So as you know, in KEA 131, we were able to provide the fewer opportunities top up for the first time now in 2021, and it was a decision to focus on students with children for the national definition. We have, Christos, you mentioned the country-specific context, and certainly students with families are a very pertinent group in Iceland. We have 1 out of 3 university students already with families, and we know that they are not participating in mobility to as much extent as they could be. The national agency would like to align between KEA 103 and KEA 107. So this will be the approach used at the beginning, at least. but the definition can be adapted with each call. And we're very much interested in opening up a dialogue with the authorities and also with the higher education institutions on how the national definition can be widened so it reflects better the wide definition of the inclusion and diversity strategy of Erasmus+. So you can expect that dialogue with you, Nanna, and colleagues from the higher education institutions to take place at the beginning of 2022. Okay, I think we are up with the time for international credit mobility, but any questions on the topic that can wait till the end of the webinar are very welcome. I will now move the slides to the next presentation. And I'm very happy to have here colleagues that will present the centralized actions of the international dimension, Erasmus Mundus on the other hand, and capacity building on the other. We have with us today Bart Cousins, who works at the executive agency for the unit in charge of Erasmus Mundus. He has been there since 2016 as project officer, and before that he worked 5 years for a higher education institution, which is a background that is highly appreciated in Brussels, I think. He contributed to the new funding rules of the Erasmus Mundus Joint Masters Action and is managing the call questions received through the mailbox on a daily basis. So a busy job description you have there, Bart. I would like to present at the same time also Belen and Zizo. Belen works at the executive agency and has been since 2009, but only since a few weeks at the unit in charge of Erasmus Mundus Joint master's degrees. She has a long experience as a policy officer in external cooperation in the field of higher education, and she worked for the Tempus program first and then for capacity building in higher education action under the Erasmus Plus program. And then she contributed to the definition of the new capacity building in higher education action for the new period just before she joined the Erasmus Mundus team. We will start with you, Bart, and then go straight to Belen. Thank you for being with us, Bart and Belen, and the floor is yours. You will let me know when you need the slide to be changed.
Thank you, Runa. Let's change the slide immediately and move on. I must say that the presentation is a bit ambitious. We have many slides, so I will go through them a bit quickly, not to bore you too much with technical details on the new program. But let's start immediately. The Erasmus Mundus Action is actually composed since the new program 2021 of 2 lots. One lot is the big EMGM, the bigger projects. They used to be called EMGMD in the former program period. A new lot is the Erasmus Mundus Design Measures, EMDM, which is a design measure. In the name, it's an action to investigate the possibility of making a joint program, of preparing, let's say, an Erasmus Mundus joint master or other joint program. Next slide, please. I will start with the Erasmus Mundus Joint Masters. So in brief, that didn't change in comparison to the past. They are high-level integrated transnational master programs implemented by international consortium of higher education institutions from different countries, at least 3 different countries, but they can also include higher education institutions from all over the world and other non-educational partners. They are supposed to be excellent in their discipline. The aim is clearly to have an excellent master program composed of 3 very good higher education institutions that join forces. It is open to all disciplines. This can be proposed bottom up by the higher education institutions implementing them. And of course, there is, as in the past, a scholarship component whereby these institutions organize a competitive selection to students worldwide and award to the best students a quite attractive scholarship. Next slide, please. In terms of objectives, why is this scheme existing? It aims to support quality, innovation, excellence, and internationalization of higher education institutions through academic cooperation within the higher education area and beyond. The focus, this program is more on cooperation than it is on scholarships and mobilities as it used to be in the past. So we changed from key action 1 to 2, and this is to be stressed. The aim is also to increase quality, the attractiveness of the higher education institution, the European higher education area as a whole, to support the EU external action in higher education, to increase synergies between higher education, innovation, and research, of course, to improve competences, skills, employability of the master graduates concerned, and to respond to societal and labor market needs. These aspects will also be reflected in the award criteria, and you will need to prove that you, if you apply, adhere to all of these criteria. Next slide, please.
You see the one on opportunities?
No, not yet, but I have it next here, so maybe I can start. If the others are able to see it.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what's in it for the higher education institution? Obviously, you get a lot of visibility in international program of excellence. It's a kind of quality trademark still. There's an attractive simplified funding scheme. We will come to that later, but the funding under the new program increased significantly, let's say, to the higher education institutions. You get structured and sustainable academic cooperation worldwide. These are long projects running more than 6 years, so it's quite it's not just a one-shot action, but many of the programs, Erasmus Mundus programs, run for even beyond 6 years for 2 consecutive periods. So all of this is adding to the sustainability. And you get to select excellent student worldwide. This is, I think, a quite good investment in future researchers, in your network, and in different things. I assume next slide, please, but I still am unable to see it.
You see no movement? No? Oh, I think Bart has a bad connection. Bart, can you hear us? Belen, everything is okay from your side?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. I suggest that I jump to the slide on capacity building while Bart gets reconnected. It's okay for you?
Of course. I'm going to be very brief about capacity building. Okay, so as you have understood already, Erasmus Plus finances as well projects in the field of capacity building in higher education. And I'm going to present this action very briefly. I just have one slide. I think Bart is connected again.
I'm sorry, I think something went wrong.
You lost the connection. How would you prefer to do, Runa? Do you want me to go on, or we go back to Bart because it was a very small break?
Since we're here and the capacity building slide,
Okay.
I think we continue with you, Belen, and
Okay,
then
very
we
good.
give the floor back to Bart.
Okay.
Bart, can you see the slides on capacity building now?
Yes, now everything seems to work just fine.
Excellent. Please, Belen, go ahead.
Okay. So I was mentioning that I'm going to be very brief. We only prepared one slide for the capacity building action, but you're of course welcome to ask all your questions in the chat of afterwards. So very briefly, what is capacity building projects? So these are international cooperation projects that are based in partnerships of institutions that work in the field of higher education. And these institutions are coming from countries associated to Erasmus Plus and countries not associated to the Erasmus Plus. There is a group of eligible non-associated countries that can participate in this action. And the characteristic of capacity building, the characteristic that makes very special this action under Erasmus Plus is that the main focus of these projects are the needs of the higher education institutions and the higher education systems in these third countries non-associated to Erasmus+. So this is the big difference with other international cooperation projects. So these capacity building projects in the field of higher education are entirely thought and entirely implemented for the benefit of the partner higher education systems and higher education institutions, so partner countries. I mean, when we talk about benefit, we are talking about the improvement of the quality and the relevance of higher education, for instance, in the local context, or in the increase of the capacity of some national bodies, of government bodies, in order to better manage the higher education in the country. Promotion of equity and inclusiveness in education, etc. Under this new phase of Erasmus+, the main difference in comparison to the past projects is that we have differentiated 3 different strands. So we are covering 3 different types of projects, from small scale projects that aim to foster access to the program, to attract small universities, universities that are less experienced, that have less international network, etc., or that are situated in remote areas. Then we have a second strand, which aims to finance projects that are more ambitious, projects that combine elements of reform and elements of innovation. So when we talk about reform, we are talking about institutional reforms, but also governance and management reforms, digitalization, quality assurance, etc. And when we talk about innovation, we refer to the relevance of the higher education system to the labor market and to the and to increase the network between higher education and industry, business, research, etc. So these 2 elements, reform and innovation, should be present in these strand 2 projects. And then the third strand is a specific strand that support structural reforms in the partner countries. So structural improvements and innovation at the level of the sector and not at the level of the individual institutions. These 3 strands receive different amounts of grant. So for the first strand, the strand that targets small-scale projects, the grant is between 200 and 400,000 euro. For the bigger projects, the more ambitious projects, the funding is between 400 and 800,000 euros. And for the structural reform projects, the amount of the grant can go from 800 to 1 million. And these projects also have the possibility to be implemented during 4 years as maximum instead of 3 years, because structural reforms are, of course, take of course much more time to implement. So we have a deadline by mid-February. It will be published in the Funding and Tender Opportunities portal, and Well, there is, and I very briefly just about the funding mechanism, because I mentioned that the novelty in comparison to the past, it refers to these three different strands, but in fact there's also another novelty under this new phase of Erasmus+, which is the funding mechanism. We were working in the past with real cost, then later we introduced the unit cost approach, and then we are aligned with other actions of Erasmus+. We are using the lump sum approach. So the way the projects will have to think their budget is about work packages. This has been harmonized, I think, for many actions in Erasmus+. So work packages, and then define the budget needs under each of the packages, and then a lump sum will be awarded by the agency, and this gives projects a lot of flexibility and a lot of especially flexibility to use the budget. It's a very simplified approach that I hope that is inviting for the institutions in Iceland to participate. So thank you very much, and well, I'm there for your questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Belen, and also for jumping in like that. I suggest that we leave the questions until the end of the webinar, but in case you have any in the chat, please feel free. Bart, I'm jumping now to where you were at. So here we were. Yes.
Sorry, I don't know what went wrong. Something technically from my side, apparently.
It happens.
So now jumping back to the joint masters, they are quite challenging in terms of requirements and require a lot of preparation. This is an important message to pass. At application stage, you already must have a number of pre-requirements in order to be able to submit. So if you are not ready this year, don't worry. For the next 4 or 5 years, there will be an annual call for proposals. But let's go through what is required to have at application stage. A jointly designed, fully integrated curriculum, common implementation procedures, including a joint selection, joint promotion, common services for the students, and so on. This needs to be described in the application. It should be delivered by a consortium, so at least a partnership of 3 higher education institutions from 3 different countries. New is that there must be only 2 from the EU member states and third countries associated to the program. So, for example, it can be Iceland, the Netherlands, and institutions from United States. Previously, you needed 3 from program countries. Now this is 2 + 1, let's say. You must be able to immediately organize a selection worldwide and give international outreach to your program. So the selection should be based on excellence, not nationality. It should be open to all students. Next slide, please. Okay, I was worried there for a moment. And there is a compulsory physical mobility for all students involved. So they can have different tracks, but each of them should have at least 2 study periods in 2 countries with a minimum duration of 1 academic semester, different from their own country of residence. There should be a description of the contribution of scholars, guest lecturers. We ideally hope that there are international congresses students can attend or at least take part in or witness online. And the master degree or program should lead to an official degree, obviously a joint degree if possible, awarded jointly by the higher education institutions involved, or a degree, a multiple degree, an official degree of each higher education institution at which the student studied. Next slide, please. What is the setup? As said, you get 74 months of funding. You commit at application stage to a number of students you are hoping to enroll. Usually this is not a problem. Not only scholarship holders, this is an important change in comparison to the past, but also non-scholarship holders. The funding, we will come to that in the next slides, is based not only on your number of scholarship holders, but also non-scholarship holders, so enrolled students. During the 74 months, you can at least organize 4 complete master editions, each lasting 1 or 2 academic years, or even 90 ECTS in between, 1.5 years. And as said, yeah, the study period should take place in at least 2 different countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, the previous slide, I think. No. Next slide, I saw it once. Okay, taking part as an individual. We went through the stats for Iceland. There has not been many students studying in Erasmus Mundus joint master degree under the previous program, but there were, I believe, 2 non-scholarship holders with the Icelandic nationality. So they're open worldwide. So what do they need to have? This is to be decided by the consortia themselves. At the very minimum, they should have a bachelor degree already, and they shouldn't have benefited previously from EMGM scholarships. Yeah, this is also in the program guide. And they apply directly to the consortia. This is not done through the executive agency. No, this is through the website, the joint website you will be creating for your program if you apply and are selected. Next slide, please. As an organization, important aspect here I'd like to mention is the need to demonstrate the accreditation at application stage. Accreditation of the courses that you will use and merge to create your new joint program of each of the higher education institutions involved as full partner, or even if you have that ready, but that's not compulsory, of the newly created joint program itself. For example, through the European approach of higher education, of European the quality assurance. This can be done, but it's not a requirement. But at a minimum, you must demonstrate that the courses you will be using are already accredited at application stage by your national authorities or accreditation agencies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, because this is covered already by Christos in his presentation. So a few words on the funding. You have your funding in this program is based on 3 different unit costs. One is the unit costs for institutions. It's very simple. It's calculated on the first 100 enrolled students. Each student you enroll, you get a funding of 750 euros per month per enrolled student, up to 100. Consortia, of course, welcome to commit to higher numbers, 200 students and so on, but there's a cap of 100 first enrolled students for which you get a funding. The same unit cost now applies to scholarship holders than non-scholarship holders, and for students from EU member states, from your own country or third countries. So this is a unified unit cost in the new program. There used to be a very complicated calculation mechanism behind. Next slide, please. The second component, obviously, are the scholarships. They also went up slightly. We do no longer divide them into subsistence costs, travel costs, institution participation costs. Now there's one fee that fits all, and it's €1,400 per month per student, per scholarship holder. The number of regular scholarships is limited to 60 for the entire duration of the program. In addition, there's also up to 30 scholarships that can be added to that for targeted regions of the world, funded by Heading 6, as explained also by Christos. Again, the same amount is paid to EU students than it is to non-EU students, to program country students, or to students from countries not associated to the program. Next slide, please. This is another novelty. There's also funds foreseen for the individual needs of students. The way it works is we took over the system from the Marie Sklodowska-Curie actions, which has in fact, I think, 10 different unit costs, but at application stage you can apply to the 2 times the maximum unit cost of €60,000, and depending on the candidates you will enroll, not just scholarships holders, but also non-scholarship holders, you can apply these funds to accommodate the special needs of students as necessary at each institution where they will study. For example, you have a visually impaired student traveling to your institution where you have everything already in place and Braille computers and so on, then you do not need to make the cost there, but this might not be available at the second institution where the student will study, and then you will use the costs there. If you do not have any student with individual needs, these funds will be transferred as additional scholarship funds. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Bart. Just to let you know, you have about 4 minutes left of your presentation, yes, so we go quickly
wrap up,
through.
Indeed. Next slide is on the additional funds. I mentioned there's 30 possible additional scholarships under the IPA and NDICI funds, but let's go to the next slide. At the time when I submitted the presentation, it was not yet known. Now it is out. It was published, the new program guide, on the 24th of November. The call will be opened soon in the FTOP with a deadline the 16th of February. The budget is 145 million overall to be able to select more or less 27 projects. And the additional scholarships for students of targeted regions are 30 eventually. There was debate until the last moment. I will maybe not go through the next slide, the award criteria. Read them very carefully because they are the basis of your selection, obviously. But let's go for the last 4 minutes to the design measures. As stated, this is something for a project if you are not quite ready to apply for a larger EMGM, then the solution is to go for the EMDM. It's smaller scale, but the principle is the same. You have a consortium already, you identified partners, you identified a relevant field, and you apply for a preparatory phase. Ideally, the aim is also to fill up a gap in the existing EMGM offer. So we are looking in particular for underrepresented EU member states, third countries associated to the program, institutions from these countries which have not yet participated in the EMGM, previously EMGMD scheme, and or thematic areas. So this is the key. You need to take a look at the existing offer through the EU catalog. The link is included in the presentation, and motivate why the new program you will be preparing deserves to be there. Is not yet there, is adding something additional to the existing course offer. Next slide, please. So there's one beneficiary who will submit the proposal, but the other institutions need to be identified and obviously need to agree. But for the sake of simplicity, there's a mono beneficiary grant we will award. It's a short duration, 15 months fixed, and also the funding is fixed, €55,000 per project. Important to say also, it's independent. There's no obligation to afterwards apply for EMGM or no guarantee that if you are awarded an EMDM that afterwards you will be awarded an EMGM. Next slide. I think I already covered this. So next slide. Yeah, this is open to, again, institutions from all over the world. Very popular also. Last call, we had around 150 applications from various countries all over the world. So it was quite successful. And it gives good hope that indeed we will be able to get a bit more and more diverse applications under the EMGM call in the future. I think I will stop here. If you have further questions on any of the two actions, please, I'm available for your questions. And this is the mailbox we are managing and quite busy on a daily basis now on the call questions.
Many thanks, Bart. So you would recommend that applicants who would like to apply for either of the two strands would turn directly to the executive agency?
Yes, of course, but if you prefer to answer some of the questions yourselves or gather the questions, this is happening in some countries as well. But yes, we are available directly for all applicants or interested higher education institutions.
Great, thank you very much for your comprehensive overview of Erasmus Mundus. It was, I'm sure, very useful, a bit technical, but this is needed for anybody who's interested in applying. We will now move from the technical side and more towards impact and personal experiences. I'm very happy to have with us today Eva Harðardóttir. She is a PhD student and an adjunct lecturer at the School of Education, University of Iceland. And Eva finished a European Masters in Lifelong Learning, Policy and Management, where she focused on global education policies and citizenship education in 2010 from the Danish School of Education and the University of Deusto in the Basque Country in Spain, in cooperation with the Institute of Education in London. Her current research focus revolves around critical global citizenship education, cultural diversity, and participatory pedagogies. Eva also has experiences within the field of development and education, working for UNICEF in Malawi for several years. So quite an impressive background you have, Eva, and we're looking forward to hearing your story about Erasmus Mundus.
Yeah, thank you, Runa. Thank you for this very nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me to reflect on my time as an Erasmus Mundus student and also to be able to share those moments with you. I think we can move to the first slide. So as Runa told you, this was a joint master's program in lifelong learning, education policy and management. And the program was split between these three universities in London, Copenhagen and Bilbao. And I spent most of my time between Copenhagen and Bilbao from, as Runa mentioned, where I graduated. Now, when I look at these pictures, I am reminded not just of my time in these particular cities or even countries, but also of the many stories shared by my fellow students, teachers and colleagues from their own lives, their own cities, and their own countries, which, of course, as we know, are placed all over the world. And we've been talking about that the Erasmus Mundus programs, they are spaces of cultural diversity, and my program was, of course, no exception to that. In fact, I think my entry into the Erasmus Mundus program was probably a bit different from what students normally do when they apply to such programs through their universities. Because when I applied, I was not really looking for an Erasmus Mundus. I was simply not aware of the option at the time. But I was looking for something along those lines, and I Googled joint degrees, movement between countries, Googled different countries and education and learning. And that led me to this particular program. However, the call for applications was directed only at third country students to study in Europe on a scholarship. And I think I'm actually very happy that I think this was addressed as a form of change probably now, the option of enrolling students based on a larger criteria. And I think it's an excellent change. But at this time, this meant technically that I was not supposed to apply to this program. But for some reasons, I really can't remember. I decided to disregard that and to apply anyways, which led me to be accepted into this program, though not on a scholarship, but accepted into the program. So I was the only student from Northern or Western Europe in this batch. And later I learned from teachers and administrators of this program that they were simply so surprised seeing my application in between the applications of students from outside of Europe, that they thought, well, why not? This could be a nice experiment. Let's just allow her into the program. And I'm very thankful, and I will be forever thankful for that, because I became a part of a group of amazingly talented students from all over the world. Now, if we move to the next slide, Runa, I mean, the fact the program requires us or requires students or offers you to move between different countries is obviously an incredibly valuable experience for any student. And for someone like me, who is interested in education and education systems in particular, this was really an amazing opportunity to navigate 3 different national education systems who all had their own regulations and rules in terms of curriculum, grading, teaching, etc. It wasn't always easy, but it definitely gave us a much deeper understanding and insight into the different expectations, values, and norms that are attached to concepts such as education and learning in different countries and also in different cultural contexts. And I think that is exactly why programs such as the Erasmus Mundus have really sort of the potential to be a game changer or a life changer for students, because it gives them the opportunity of dislocating from their usual stories or their usual ways of doing things, both physically and mentally, and allows them to position themselves in other kinds of stories who might be completely different from their own. And this, of course, brings about plurality in various shapes and forms. And I'm citing both scholars and policy work here because it really resonates with the most important thing of all when it comes to education, at least from my perspective, and that is learning how to live together on the basis of diversity and difference. And if we move to the next slide, some even say that education is not even the result of carefully laid out lessons or lesson plans or programs, such as the Erasmus Mundus, but that it actually happens in these very special in-between moments of contrast and disruption, And I really think that the Erasmus Mundus is kind of a unique place for such moments to occur. And I want to share with you such a moment that took place as a part of my program. Actually happened on the very first day of the Erasmus Mundus program. There are many more I could talk about, but this particular story, I chose it because it can be seen as a trivial moment, a fleeting moment that did not really have a particular aftermath, but at the same time, it was incredibly powerful. So on the very first day, I arrived to Copenhagen to begin the program. We were invited for a sightseeing tour around the city. And I had lived in Copenhagen before, so I was not too excited about the tour. And I even remember asking if I could just skip the tour and wait until the other students had sort of gone to see the city. But luckily I was not allowed to do that. So I went to the tour with the other students, sort of thinking that I knew it all, but decided, yeah, I'll go along. So the first stop we make is at the City Hall Square called Rathhusplatz in Danish. Some of you might know this place. It's a big square. And as we stand there making this first stop, suddenly one of my fellow students, Helena from Serbia, grabs my arm and whispers to me, "Eva, do you see this?" And I look around and I see the usual things I am used to see at this square. People running around with shopping bags, people eating those traditional Danish hot dogs, people celebrating in front of the city hall. So I reply, "What? See what?" As I do not detect anything unusual. "This," she says, pointing towards two ladies who are walking down the steps of the city hall, dressed in white, surrounded by their friends and families who are celebrating their wedding. "Yeah, I see them. They're getting married," I say casually, and look at Helena to see that she has tears running down her cheeks. And I suddenly realize that me and Helena, we are experiencing a moment, an educational moment, a moment of what we have and what we don't have. A moment reflecting human rights one of us has taken for granted and the other one is still fighting for. So if we move to the next slide, Runa. Now it's been more than 10 years since I graduated from the Erasmus Mundus program, and I'm still in contact with many of the people I met there during this time, both teachers and students. And I'm a part of a very active alumni network for Erasmus Mundus students. I have written articles and presented at conferences with people who share similar academic interests as me, while with others I have formed lifelong friendships. Me and my husband, we have attended weddings. My children have connected to children of former students and people I've met all over the world. So my story is clearly shaped, both professionally and personally, by the Erasmus Mundus program, but most recognizably by the people who shared this journey with me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva, for sharing your moving story and for bringing out these examples of educational moments and in-between moments, as you called them, and for demonstrating that it is not always clear the difference between the two, because we learn so much from each moment.